everyone coming from different backgrounds and having different opportunities wasn't something that I was still understanding at the time,
Mm,
I couldn't help but think that I was an outlier.
mm,
So, the imposter syndrome day by day just kicked in, and I was sabotaging myself because I kept repeating that same rhetoric that I didn't belong there.
mm.
And it got to the point where I did sort of believe it, where even if, I started doing just as well as my other peers, that there was an exception for me to be on campus versus other people being quote unquote deserving of being there.
Mm. Welcome, friends. So excited for another episode of the Breaking Barriers podcast. I'm Josh Lopez Reyes, your host, and also the executive director of EPIC, the Echo Park Immigration Center. And this is a new project. And so, thank you, Eric, for being here and being one of our very first guests on this new podcast. Can't wait for the audience to get to hear your story a little bit today. So, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Josh, for having me as a guest on the Epic Breaking Barriers podcast. It's definitely an honor and privilege to get to share my story today. So, as you already mentioned, my full name is Eric Guillermo Estrada Oaxaca, and I'm currently an engineering associate for the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. And I was born in South LA, grew up in South Bay in LA County, specifically Gardena and Hawthorne. And even though I'm a recent graduate from UCLA for class of 2022 and 2021, and I have a short-lived career, I still am really excited to share what I've learned so far and excited for any future experiences that I come across as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Eric, again for being here, for being willing to, dive into this new project with us. And again, the purpose of this podcast is really to encourage our audience, right? Our epic community, our epic youth, but also anybody, in life that, despite difficult situations, despite whatever life brings us, right, that we can continue to break barriers and we can continue to achieve our vocational dreams and goals. And I couldn't think of a better person really to share their story today, like yourself, because I know you mentioned you're a young leader, but I feel like you've already been through so much. And one,
Kind of to preface, I was going to say that you've known me for a decade and you actually met me kind of in the midst of the entire situation, but
Mhm.
so I remember I was a junior in high school, and I was having like a normal day. Well, actually, that's far from true. I was really sick that day, and normally I don't get really sick, and even if I do, I usually tend to go to school. But this particular day was really, really bad. I had like sinuses, coughs, and etc. Like I definitely needed to call um, home to come home, and to my surprise, I found out that my dad had a stroke. And
Mm,
so that was definitely something that was new to me. And I remember when we went to the hospital, we kind of were expecting to pick him up and then go about our day and kind of unpack what happened. But he ended up being in turned into a vegetative state. So it definitely was a really big shock. A little more background. So I come from a family of low income immigrants. So I've definitely firsthand witnessed the trials and tribulations that my immediate and extended family experienced working a tiresome minimum wage job. And at the time, my dad was the only one who was working since my mom was a um, stay at home mom. So because my dad was the major or only source of income growing up, I had to expeditiously adjust emotionally and financially as the future caretaker for my family. And since my mother kind of remained unemployed throughout high school and also undergrad, we were left with no income. So low income turned into no income. So
mm,
it was already hard to, kind of get by through our regular means. And for it to be such a more drastic shift, was something that I personally was not prepared for, especially for my age. Um, and I remember taking on random job opportunities during my time, just so that I can help any means I could for both my mom and I. It consisted of like being a paid tutor, um, community events at Gardena, being a home assistant, babysitting, just other things that I could, do to help sustain myself. And a lot of the time, I didn't know where my next meal would come, sadly. But because the high school I went to was also predominantly a low income community, specifically a Title I school, which just meant that more than 80% of the students were classified as low income. So they would give us free lunches, and most schools have lunch numbers, but our school didn't have a lunch number since most of us qualified for free lunch anyways, so they didn't see the need for it. So I remember sometimes after eating my own lunch, I'd secretly go back in line and get a second lunch, because I didn't have anything to eat when I'd come home. Um, and, I had a lot of support from friends and family, which I'm definitely thankful for. You being one of the biggest supporters that I had during the time as well. But, that support only went so far. I remember waking up every day and thinking that nothing was really going to change. And mostly because at the time it felt like it was out of my control. But I knew more than anything that I needed to change my outlook and, start emphasizing what I was going to do after high school. Because as a lot of us here growing up, common rhetoric that's thrown out there is that going to college, pursuing a higher education degree opens opportunities, job opportunities specifically, that leads to a higher paying job. And because I knew that if I were to um, not do anything or not pursue higher education, that I would most likely not be able to sustain a living wage for my mom and I, because I was able to witness how hard it was already for my immediate family and extended family to work on a low income wage. Um, I just knew that my survival instinct fueled me to pursue higher education. And um, I was really scared when it came to applying to colleges, mostly because knowing that it wasn't necessarily a cheap option, or, especially before I found out what financial aid even was, knowing that it was really expensive, it seemed out of reach or impossible. And because no one had really talked about the struggles or limited resources that really comes with applying and attending college, I was overwhelmed at the time.
Mm.
I didn't know what to expect, and truthfully, I didn't know what I needed to provide so that I could apply to college or attend college. So, my biggest first step was figuring out the application process for both the school and financial aid form. And then from there, my journey had a snowball effect where I was learning and figuring it out as I go, which led me to where I am today.
Mm. Yeah, thanks for just scratching the surface, on
Yeah,
your story. And it's again just kind of hard to believe, really, because if you look on this side of where we're at, at the end of 2023, to
right.
think like you've achieved so much, again at an early age. And I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing some of those difficult times, right? With obviously what happened to your father, and growing up in that context, right? Which again, a lot of our community members are in a similar context. I grew up in a similar context. And definitely, it's a lot easier to go a different route. And so I really commend you to for like overachieving in many ways, right? And I know you're being humble and didn't
Thank
say
you.
this, but would you graduate high school with like a 5.0 or something like that?
Um, so I was
Close.
a pretty good student throughout high school. I remember I was ranked number two for my class and cohort, but I also do want to share that I actually grew up not always being a really good student. Um, I was always placed in like the slower paced classes when it came to English. And I don't know if it's because English and Spanish was a language I was learning at the same time growing up, but I just in general have always struggled with English, and reading comprehension and everything associated with that subject, and history and science. So anything
Mm.
that wasn't math. Um, and I, and so that also carried out in middle school. I also struggled in middle school. I wasn't doing too well in my classes. I wasn't doing really bad, but I wasn't like getting as many A's as I would in the future. And
Mm,
um I don't know necessarily like what happened, but I remember after I came out, which happened to, so I do identify as queer. So after I came out in the summer before ninth grade, I kind of had a different, or I gained more self-awareness about how our um, society can be a bit heteronormative, and I don't know if that kind of just opened my eye on how I in the future would learn new things, but I
mm,
ended up just doing better in school. I
interesting.
think maybe because I was more comfortable with who I was, I started to feel more motivated instead of being kind of disassociated or detached when I realized that I didn't know or understand something, because I kind of would halt or freeze and try not to understand something that was difficult for me to process at the time when growing up. So
Yeah.
I was only comfortable in things that I was quote unquote already good at.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. You've never shared
Mhm.
that, and so it's really interesting to hear that. Like, yeah, actually, when you were saying that, I was gonna ask, like, what was there something that
Yeah.
sparked that? But yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, and it makes a lot of sense. I think, you know, yeah, feeling comfortable in our own skin, right? I think that's one of the most powerful things any of us
Right.
could do, and yeah, that's powerful. So really, really appreciate you, sharing that, and you know, uh, so you graduate number two in your class and get a full ride scholarship to UCLA, right?
I
Which
did, yes.
congratulations again. Like we're all
Thank
so proud of
you.
you for that, and again, it's an inspiration to many. But not only you go on and do other great things, but could you, before moving on to that, like could you share a little
Yeah.
bit about that experience? Being a first generation college student, right, and kind of you know dealing with all these amidst all these things that you have already shared, during this time, right, of starting college.
Right, most definitely. Um, so as I mentioned, I struggled a bit with figuring out like how the application process and financial aid process was for the specific colleges that I was applying to, which was the UCs and the Cal States, because I remember my career center, which was my um, safe space slash um, where I learned how to apply to college and everything that I needed to know in that near future. Um, I knew that they had for low income students at the time four free applications for the UCs and four free applications for the Cal States. I sadly did not know how to apply to the private schools, which I believe is the Common App interface. But it's okay because I definitely am really happy with going to UCLA for both undergrad and grad. Um, but
And
I
graduating debt
remember
free,
that.
right? Like,
Uh,
it,
yes,
which if
yes.
you go to private school, you don't know if that's the case. Like, it's harder to do
That's
that. So,
true. That's true. At the time, I was really anxious and kind of just thinking that even though I'm applying and submitting this application for free, which was like a major reason why I submitted it in the first place, because application fees can be really expensive.
right,
And at the time, I wasn't really having a lot of like extra money to spare.
right.
Um, and I kind of not that I didn't try my application, but I kind of didn't think anything more of it after applying, because in my head I was kind of already having that mindset or telling myself that, even if you got in, how would you afford to go?
Mm,
you know
right,
um and so I applied to community college, as of course, as like as in all means, anyone or everyone should apply to community college, if they think that a four-year university is out of reach financially,
right.
or also if you aren't settled with like what you want to do or what you want to study when first starting out, right? I think community
Exactly.
college is an important place to apply to, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to afford college, through my own means, and maybe even after applying to financial aid, because I didn't really know what to expect from it. I started learning how to apply to scholarships.
Mm,
So I actually applied to a lot of scholarships that specifically catered for low income students. And the ones that I specifically applied to also applied to Latinos specifically, but there was definitely a lot of other ones that was for low income students in general, first generation college students like me in general.
Mm,
And so I applied to a lot. I tried to apply as many as I could, as many as I found, which also was something that I'd come across at the Career Center because the staff member there usually had like a little pile of scholarships that previous students had applied to or specifically have earned
mm,
so that they have like a record of like, hey, our students can continue to applying these scholarships because our previous students have gotten them in the past,
mm.
which was definitely really helpful. Even though I mean, I got one, which was great. I remember it was this a small one for $500 each year.
Yeah.
Um, but I for UCLA specifically, when I was receiving my applications little by little for the Cal States and UCs, um, I was pretty happy every time I get an acceptance. It's awesome to see um your hard work reflected into reassurance from these like higher educations,
Hmm.
or receiving this reassurance from the higher education after working so hard. But
Right.
I remember always opening the financial aid packet or like their cost of attendance estimate actually after receiving these acceptances, and then always seeing like a really big figure, and then thinking like, it's great that I got accepted, but don't think I can
Right.
go. Um, and that actually happened with like almost all the schools because UCLA wasn't one of the first ones that rolled out their applications or their acceptance letters. I think it was the second to last school that I had
Oh,
opened. And I remember I opened it, was really happy that I got in, and then checked the financial aid, or no, sorry, the cost of attendance the next day, just assuming that it was going to be like some big number, and got really confused when I opened it and saw zero. I was like rereading it like over and over again because I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And so I guess like this outside of scholarships that you can apply to externally, I guess some schools have like internal
right.
scholarships that they award some students through their regular application process. So
Exactly.
luckily, the admission officer, whoever had my application, decided to appoint me for that scholarship, which
Wow.
was honestly one of the major reasons why I was able to attend that school in the first place.
Yeah.
So I'm really thankful to that admission officer and whoever it is, and really thankful for the scholarship in the first place. I definitely think, everyone who can and has the power to should apply to external help that's already there.
Right.
A scholarship. I think the biggest thing is finding them in the first place.
Exactly.
I think that's the biggest struggle. I know a lot of peers who definitely, could have gone to school with more help financially through scholarships who just didn't know at the time
Exactly.
where to find them or how to find them, how to fill them out, which is definitely a common theme with being a first generation college student. The biggest thing that you're gonna, fight with is maybe not knowing some things that might be obvious for someone else just because it's your first time and you have no one to guide you or point you towards these resources.
Exactly, exactly. No, and again, that's why it's so encouraging to hear your story because you're a very resourceful person, and that's something I admire about you. I know we kind of share some
Thank you.
commonalities, right? And like not wasting resources, right? Like and just
Yeah.
and it's so inspiring to see, like obviously how just were really smart. I remember even. Um, when you were transitioning from college to graduate school, right, you're like weighing your options and seeing like what who's gonna, like instead
I
of like we're a
was,
lot of
yes.
times, right, when we were first generation, like we're just like we'll take whatever we can get, but you were like, no, I'm gonna see who's gonna give me the best package, right, which is a really smart way to think about
Yeah.
it. And really, again, I think it's so really really inspiring to hear and see. But if you wouldn't mind, like I would love to hear specifically too, like how that experience was in college. Especially as you mentioned, somebody who identifies as queer, as a first generation, college student from an immigrant family, like these places oftentimes weren't made from our communities, right, or for our communities.
Right.
And so, like, what was that experience like for you being at UCLA at first?
Yeah, most definitely. So kind of just to preface, since the community I grew up in was predominantly Black and Brown and fellow POC people who also were of low income backgrounds, most of the community I made amongst my peers were fellow low income POCs. And
Mm,
so my friends and I sharing the same experiences and turmoils made me never question my upbringing. It was
mm,
kind of almost like a standard,
right.
which later I'd learn would be kind of like a problem or more so a rude awakening once I got exposed to a different community at UCLA.
Mm,
So once I first took like my first steps there, or first immersed myself in other people who were going to be in my major or school of engineering, I quickly learned that um, a lot of the people came from affluent
mm-hmm,
areas, which was definitely something that I wasn't used to.
right.
As I mentioned, I was just so used to having people who shared similar stories to
Right.
me. And so that was definitely a shock at first.
Mm,
It was especially a shock because I remember when I got accepted, I was placed into they call it the Center of Excellence for Engineering Diversity, which is kind of just like a diversity program that specifically caters towards um, first generation students who come from diverse backgrounds who also tend to be from lower incomes. And so that experience that I had was within the diversity program in itself, so it only got worse the more I like actually came to learn what the School of Engineering is composed of. I think for my specific cohort, um, I don't think it includes transfers though. So for the people who entered as first years, I think we only had two or three Black
wow.
engineers. Not just for my major, for the School of Engineering at
Wow.
UCLA. Yeah, so it was definitely something to get used to. And the culture shock did get to me. It was one of those things that I struggled with, more specifically my first 2 years of undergrad, because by the end of it, I was kind of like, I already digested the concept and learned to live with it and adjust
Mm-hmm,
accordingly. But seeing so many people come from those affluent communities, um, and yeah, was the biggest shock to me. And I know there are people who did grow up similar to my upbringing who were already aware of that contrast. But that just wasn't my case. It was my first time having that encounter, and it was just overwhelming.
mm,
Um, and another thing is that I remember when I first showed up to UCLA, it was also for like an orientation. So I remember they welcomed all of us, and then shortly after, kind of give like a summary statistic of what the um, accepted students, how they performed in like the standardized test. Because when I was applying to college, you did have to take the SAT. I know it's optional now, but they had said that my cohort for the School of Engineering had an average SAT score of like 1480 out of 1600, and SAT subject math test score of 1800 out of 1800 on average. Um, yeah, which is 100%.
yeah.
And that was definitely not the case for me. I may have been like a good student, but that was not the case for me. I think I had like, yeah, like far below the average. So hearing that those people or like my future peers were already doing so much better in these standardized tests that everyone was taking, and because everyone coming from different backgrounds and having different opportunities wasn't something that I was still understanding at the time,
Mm,
I couldn't help but think that I was an outlier.
mm,
So the imposter syndrome day by day just kicked in, and I was sabotaging myself because I kept repeating that same rhetoric that I didn't belong there.
mm,
And it got to the point where I did sort of believe it, where even if, I started doing just as well as my other peers, that there was an exception for me to be on campus versus other people being quote unquote deserving of being there.
mm,
And so I think one of the biggest challenges that I had to overcome was more of like a social slash mental experience that I was having at UCLA,
mm,
aside from, the um, other challenges that people may face when going to college for the first time, which might be like, learning your studying habits
Right.
and other things that are more focused on academia. But I think a lot of my struggles came from um, my experience overall on the community.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. That's, I mean, so true, right? Again, as you know, as a first generation college graduate too, like, and definitely mentioned grew up in a similar context. Like that is difficult, right? To go through that, to experience the imposter syndrome, right? To feel like we don't belong, or like we're less deserving to be in these situations, or like I've experienced it too, where it's almost like you're grateful, but at the same time, part of me is like sad, that there's not more of our people, right? Our peers, people that also deserve to be in these situations of achieving higher education, or of just being able to, like you mentioned it, like it kind of comes down to, right, or the world that we live in, it's like kind of comes down to like really people kind of pursuing their gifts and talents and dreams to like put bread on the table instead of just working like any job, like especially in immigrant communities and lower resource communities, right, often tends to be the case. um,
Right.
so thank you for sharing that. And definitely, you know um, I think it's so important, right, for like people and communities and just support during that time, because we can oftentimes feel isolated, feel alone. And that's part of like the work that we're trying to do with our youth community at Epic, is like really accompany people and to remind them that they're not alone. Because again, personally experiencing it and like just hearing so many stories like yours, it's very common. And yeah, it's like, was there a switch, or like how, because obviously, I mean, you've now graduated not only from college, but from your master's program there. And like, was there a switch at some time that you finally, because you mentioned like your first 2 years, I don't know if something changed, and if so, what was it?
After like my first 2 years, I kind of felt more established with where I was heading towards finishing my undergraduate degree, and I wasn't doing as bad as I thought I would. I didn't fail a class at the time, and so I was like, I'm doing something right. I'm doing something right, and I learned that despite it feeling um, unfair to see other people have more resources or opportunities presented to them, it's also just not fair to compare yourself to someone else's standard. No matter how similar someone's story may be or different, we all have our own unique life and journey that we're
Right,
pursuing.
right.
And it's just, yeah. And so after I kind of just like reminded myself that I need to stop comparing myself to other people and
Mm.
just focus on me, focus on my own successes, that's definitely what helped me um, remove that imposter syndrome mentality.
Those are wise words. That's so important, And like it's so easy, right? Like literally we live in a world where we're constantly seeing what other people are doing, what they're wearing, where they're traveling, what they're, eating, right? Like that's the world we live in, and where we're constantly
Right.
comparing
Yeah.
ourselves to our peers. And like I think that's so wise to like settle and to be content, right, with our own journey, right, not compare ourselves. And yeah, those are definitely wise words. Really really happy to hear that. And if you wouldn't mind like sharing, what was it like to graduate, and then like to have that option, right, to go to graduate school?
Right. Um, so it's kind of funny because I had my last year of my undergraduate degree online because the pandemic happened for the spring quarter of my third year. And so everything was online completely my last year. And so I never had initial intentions of going to or pursuing a master's program when I first started I was focused on getting my first degree,
Of course, yeah.
I was focusing on getting my first degree first. I had never really thought about what would happen afterwards. And so I remember specifically when it was kind of like halfway through my last year in undergrad, I was starting to apply to full-time jobs because, I wanted to make sure that um, I had something to look forward to afterwards, especially since I was still financially struggling and I didn't have that privilege or comfortability to kind of just wait a while and then somehow find a job. Like I kind of
Right.
wanted to rush into it a little bit, you know.
Of
But at the
course.
same time, you know, I really liked what I was studying and I was excited to join my career in general. But I yeah, I was applying to full-time jobs and I wasn't really hearing back from the coming months, especially kind of near the later half of um, that school year. And I remember having a friend who initially started in the same cohort as me, a close friend of mine actually, who ended up graduating in 3 years instead of four. And she did a master's program at UCLA for the same major that I
Mm,
did. And she was telling me how apparently UCLA had a fellowship program that specifically catered for people with diverse backgrounds, who where the fellowship would um, cover the expenses needed for that master's program. So I decided to still continue to apply to full-time jobs, but also apply to that specific master's program, um, and see if I had a shot of getting the fellowship, you know, since I kind of wanted to have momentum with whatever was going to happen after my getting my first degree.
right.
And I was also applying in internships because, you know, I kind of got desperate and was like picking at straws, like, you know, let me leave myself open and continue to apply. And when I learned that a lot of schools were omitting the need for the GRE because of the pandemic, I decided to explore more options than just UCLA. So I only applied to two other schools that were in NorCal, but any school that specifically omitted the GRE and was willing to give me a free application by reaching out and letting them know my financial constraints, I applied and just tried to see what options I could have, you know. And luckily and thankfully, UCLA was the one that had the best financial aid packet, and also the one I was most excited about because my specific program was only going to be for a year.
Right.
And I'd, you know, despite any obstacles that I had with higher education, I knew that that wasn't necessarily exclusive to
Right.
UCLA. Um, so I still enjoyed my time at UCLA, which is definitely another reason why I decided to get my master's there too.
Definitely. No, that's so exciting. And like for those, who are not in college yet or thinking about college and listening, like a lot of times that's a really cool thing that you think, oh, what is graduate school, right? What is getting a master's degree? But oftentimes, like when you go to school for undergraduate, right, studies in, you're studying the same field, which in your case you did, right?
Yes.
It's only like a year of studies more, so you just kind of knock it out in a year, which goes by so fast. And obviously it's hard work, but again, really congratulate you and commend you on just doing that, again at such an early age. And we've talked about this of course offline of how that experience was in comparison, right? But if you wouldn't mind sharing, like what was it to be a graduate student, and especially like you're 1 year removed, right? It's not even like a lot of graduate students are in
Yeah.
their 30s, 40s, 50s, or higher, and they're well established in their careers, sometimes working full time. But like, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so I definitely had two adjustments to kind of face. So we officially came off on, removed ourselves from online school and went back to being in person for the start of my graduate program. And so, you know, even though a little more than half was in person, which is kind of crazy to think about how 1 year and a quarter was online. But because more than half was in person, I knew what to expect in that sense, but it had been so long that kind of felt like I was starting anew again,
Mm,
especially since I was seeing new faces. You know, I wasn't coming back to the same people who were originally in my classes, which in general was like an experience at college. But once I was in like my upper divs for undergrad, I kind of was seeing like the same faces over and over again. But
right.
the point I was trying to make is that, um, yeah, I remember walking in and then realizing that um, people were definitely um, coming from much different backgrounds compared to how my undergrad was, um, in the sense of like, holistically speaking, like age, location, and then previous studies. It wasn't just people who had the same major as me for their first degree, or maybe even their second degree, because there were some people
Right.
who already had a master's and was getting a master's in that school. So it's cool and exciting to kind of meet other people who had very much different journeys than I did, and finding out the reasons on why they specifically were pursuing a master's degree. Um, but to answer your question, um, yeah, I definitely noticed that most people were a bit older, but I also had one classmate specifically who was on the same boat as me, where what I mean by that is that they also came from my undergraduate program, and then also directly after I did the graduate program. So it was nice to have someone who I can relate to and already knew to walk through that adjustment.
Totally. No, thanks for sharing that. And you kind of alluded to this already, but like, what was that experience like? Obviously, we everybody, not one person was untouched by the pandemic, right? So we all had to shift and make
Yeah.
adjustments. But what was that like for you? To obviously kind of finish out your undergrad, and then it also kind of transitioned to, even though you're in person, like what were the shifts? How did you adapt and make do?
Yeah, for sure. So as I'd mentioned, the pandemic did start. Um, I remember it was my finals week for winter quarter of my third year, and we had just gotten the initial notification saying that COVID-19 had emerged, or the first cases of COVID-19 had emerged, and that we were just going to be isolated for, I think they estimated 2 weeks or so, or 3 weeks, because we had spring break anyways, and we had intentions of coming back right after. But, as everyone knows, that wasn't the case at all. It ended up lingering or extending for a much longer period of time. So I remember my spring quarter of my third year, um, which was online, I was home. And that was definitely kind of difficult to adjust to. I grew up in a packed household, so there was a lot of different immediate families. Well, specifically my family, but more than just my immediate family under a roof. And so I already knew that I wasn't going to come back home having my own space, because I never really had my own space, had never really had my own bed at that point, and knew that I was going to be in a much louder environment than what I got accustomed to from dorming at
Mm,
UCLA. So having to adjust to that again was definitely something, and it was much different than when I was in high school or K through 12 in general, growing up in that
right.
situation, because the I just felt like I had to spend a lot more time studying than I did in the
Right.
past, and it was a little bit harder to focus. So I remember my last year of undergrad, I made the decision to move back to Westwood. Um, and well, another reason also that motivated that was because we were such in a packed household. We had no means to isolate. So if any of us did end up getting COVID-19, we really could not isolate. Like there would be no proper way to reduce emissions aside from wearing masks and washing hands and other preemptive actions. But it would just be so hard to avoid one-on-one contact because you're always next to someone.
Right.
um, and because I lived with like older people, and because I had the financial means to move to Westwood because of the scholarship, I decided that overall it would be much better if I just went back to Westwood my last year. So once I did, it was still definitely adjustment to not go to class in person every day, specifically when it came to like extracurriculars, because sometimes it'd be like a little awkward to do things remotely, especially when working with projects and tasks and stuff. But of course, everyone figured it out and made it work. Oh, excuse me, sorry. But um, but yeah, luckily I adjusted, and um, it came with like time to kind of normalize the online experience, and then also having to adjust again, shifting from online again to in person, um, was like another thing too. But
Totally. No, that makes sense. Like
yeah,
you broke up your pretty much
yeah,
your 4 years in undergrad, like, right, we can kind of going back and forth in a way.
Yeah,
And yeah, thanks for also sharing about that experience, right? About growing up in a multifamily household, which tends to be the case for a lot of,
right,
where it's actually kind of more normal than not, right? As opposed to other cultures or
right,
communities. And so, and no, what you shared, I heard a lot of people experiencing that, especially those who were like at a school for college, or and that impacted a lot of people's educational experience. So yeah, thanks for sharing a little glimpse into that experience. And like, moving on,
right,
again, like, so proud of you for um graduating, obviously, not only undergrad, but your master's, and then you just really seeing you being proactive, and not taking, like, what I see a lot of times, and especially like first generation college graduates, like, we don't have these networks oftentimes, right? Because our parents or guardians or ancestors didn't get these connections, and so oftentimes we're like unnetworked, and like graduate because that's what everybody says, because it's like you graduate then you get a job,
right,
right? But that's this doesn't fall from the sky. Like, it takes a lot of proactive, door knocking and getting yourself out there. And I really saw you do that throughout both your undergrad, and even when you were a graduate student. And so obviously it made sense that you like immediately pretty much found a job in your career. And so I want to ask you more specific questions about like your day to day now, right? Of
right.
like being in this world. But particularly, if you wouldn't mind sharing too, like, engineering, civil engineering is a pretty male dominated field, right? And like, as somebody who identifies as queer, like, how has that experience been, from, your undergrad and now moving into the professional world?
Right. Another thing that was kind of unique to my upbringing was that I happened to have a lot more women or girls in my classes growing up. And it was kind of like a very noticeable ratio difference where it was like, I think 54 girls to 6 guys, like very much more girls than guys, which is something that I had gotten accustomed to. And I remember when I was applying to civil engineering, I knew engineering in general had the stereotype, or I mean, it is true that it's a male dominated career. And so it wasn't something that I put much thought into until I saw it firsthand. So I do identify as gender queer. And even though I do pass off as like a cis male, my specific experience is going to be very different than a woman entering the space.
Right.
Um, but in general, it was kind of like I had to be a little more self conscious, or I felt more self conscious. Not that I had to be. I felt more self conscious about the spaces that I was in. But luckily, everyone in my cohort was really nice, so I didn't have any negative experiences when it came to that. But I'm really happy to be in an era where I can see efforts are being put to unpack misogyny that's was previously found in engineering. And even though we aren't where we need to be, it's great to see that there's progress.
Mm.
So
The representation piece, right? Like, it's not fully there, but
I'm just really thankful that we're definitely living in a more progressive area,
right.
that we don't have to experience things that people had much worse back then. Like I mentioned, we definitely are far from being where we need to be, but
Mm,
seeing the efforts is so motivating, and I think ties into how inclusivity is so important in any career, not just engineering. Inclusivity is kind of like the bare minimum that should be a thing, a standard. Um,
mm,
because fostering a community is definitely something that eliminates kind of like previous things that I had mentioned before, like imposter syndrome or not feeling like you
mm.
belong and other things.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that. And what it reminds me of, again, like, why we chose to name this podcast that, right? Like, breaking barriers, because oftentimes we're doing that with our bodies. We're by embodying who we are, oftentimes we're breaking those barriers. And like you're saying, it's becoming different, right? And oftentimes we're the ones to make those changes, right? By kind of uh, we're literally breaking barriers, pioneering, being, and that's
Right.
not easy work though. It does get exhausting, but like you said, thankfully, obviously there's been generations before us, right, who've been fighting for civil rights and for equality and change. But definitely, like, the mantle has been passed, and there's still work to do in this world. And um, you know, definitely appreciate you kind of shedding some light into that experience, and would love to also just kind of ask you, like, how has, because you are somebody that you know is always kind of been proactive, again, like we were mentioning, and getting finding this current career that you have, right? Like, it didn't just fall in your lap. Like, you're always proactive and, like, juggling multiple things while you're studying full time and whatnot, and, like, involved in your community. And so if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit more of, like, how you balanced all these different internships and your studies and work, and how that kind of shaped you both professionally and personally.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm gonna start with high school actually. So in high school, I was in a good amount of extracurricular activities, and I actually never felt um, obligated to do these extracurriculars for the sake of looking competitive on a application. I generally was like interested in the clubs that I was in. A lot of them were led by my friends, which was like another reason why I was in them in the first place, just to be in the same space with them and hang out. Um, but when it came to college, and I, I did have like a learning curve where I learned that I needed to change the way I studied. I needed to put a lot more time and effort into how I studied and grasped concepts, just because I felt like the material I was exposed to was a lot harder than what I was used to. Um, so I wasn't too involved my first year
Mm.
specifically. I felt like I had just a priority for my academics, but then I remember my second year, I kind of missed the like sense of community that you get from joining extracurricular activities in general, whether it be specifically for your professional development or just something that you enjoy.
Right.
Um, and so, and also because I felt a little more adjusted and a little more prepared to how I can divide my time by my second year. Not too well. I think I like did a lot better once I was near the end. But since I was a little better, I decided to slowly, join clubs that I had really wanted to join in the first place, and a lot of them were mentorship focused, specifically within my career, but clubs that offered mentorship, because I think mentorship was something that definitely carried me or helped me and guided me through um, you know being proactive, and what kind of helped me get to where I am today. It was definitely through like the personal network and personal connections that I got to make from meeting people who happen to know someone else, and then that domino effect of meeting someone who can take you to the next level, if that makes
Mm.
sense, or just provide a helping hand. But yeah, so I was a project director for ASCE, which is the American Society of Civil Engineers, for our environmental design club that we had. And so that was like a really great platform to exercise my leadership skills while still gaining skills for both industry and academic pursuits. And then I was also a Chi Epsilon board member, which is kind of just like an honor society that specifically catered or focused on improving the professional development for other civil engineers. Um, and I think being part of those clubs and spending my time there during undergrad definitely helped me, as I mentioned, build those networks and build the foundation that I found necessary to succeed in higher education in general.
Amazing, amazing. And you were also involved with another project, right? Uh, I know multiple ones, but
Yes.
you you did some type of work in Nicaragua. Can you share more about that also?
Oh, yes, yes. So I was also part of the Engineers Without Borders, specifically our Nicaragua project. We had, I think, four different projects that you could be part of, but I just decided to choose Nicaragua. At the time, I had never traveled outside of the country. I still haven't actually, spoiler, but um, that was like the major reason why I decided to do it. And aside from that, I truly do believe that every engineer should be capable of understanding the economic, political, and cultural context of a
Hmm.
situation, because a lot of the work we do tends to reflect in our communities. And so I think people understanding those different contexts really helps with how we plan certain things. But yeah, so I was part of that project. It was specifically to build a schoolhouse in Nicaragua, in a little city in Nicaragua. But however, because of the political climate that was going on at the time, we weren't allowed to travel there. Um, so everything that we did was remote implementation. And then once the political climate was like a bit better where we could travel, the pandemic had happened. And so there was just like a lot of like unfortunate events that kind of led us, or a series of unfortunate events as to why we never really went to Nicaragua during my specific time, because I know that the project did end up going afterwards. It was definitely a really great project to be part of, and I was really happy to be a part of it, even though I didn't get to go see the work that we did in person. Because just knowing that our contribution was providing opportunities to disadvantaged youth was like priceless. You know, I think one of the biggest things that is really necessary for everyone to do is kind of give back to your communities when you can.
Exactly.
Um, I know that I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the helping hands that other people decided to give, or the time and effort that other people decided to give when I asked for help. So I'm always happy to like give back as well. And I think more people should definitely do that.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. That's a great segue as we kind of close out to like quick hitters here. And again, thank you for just sharing a little bit about your
Yeah.
story. It's so inspirational, and to that point about like giving back and mentoring, right? Like I really appreciate it how you framed it, like you know um, in the context of the question you were answering, right, of how it like it influences us obviously like professionally, right, because it's a good experience, leadership experience, but it's also like a personal thing, right? It's it's a reminder that we all need a helping hand. And yeah, if you wouldn't mind like going a little bit more into like because I know you've given back to tutoring and helping out others, right? Mentoring others, and why is that so important? And how has that played a role in your journey?
Specifically during the pandemic year, since it was kind of hard to do our normal outreach events that, or in general for any club, it was kind of hard to do outreach events because you weren't in
Hmm.
person. And I know that there was like already a internal battle that a lot of people in K through 12 were going through when adjusting to
Right.
Zoom or Google Meets or any internet platform that they had for their
Right.
online school. Um, but I remember my math teacher, or specifically my calc teacher in high school, had reached out to me and asked if I had any time to help like tutor some of the kids in his calc class, his current calc class. So I was like, I'm more than happy to, try my best to tutor these students through Google
Mm.
Meets. And so it was definitely something that I was really happy that my old teacher reached out and asked me to do, because I knew that a lot of people were going through like a learning adjustment. I myself was going through a learning adjustment from going to online school. And it was just really nice to give back to the same high school that I went
Mm.
to, especially since I knew that resources were so limited compared to other schools in the area.
Definitely. And like again, I think that's why it's so important and inspiring to hear your story, because like a lot of people, once they kind of make it, so to speak, like they don't want to like go back, right, and give back. And so like that I think is just really admirable. And want to encourage you to keep going, right, as you like, even like you were saying about these
Right.
like these clubs that you're in, of like empowering other people in your career field, or helping out other folks that need that helping hand, right, and remembering like and I was in a similar boat, right, like I'm doing this work now literally because like other people helped me and saw something in me that I didn't
Yes.
even see in myself. And I just think like the more that we all do that, it's a ripple effect. And so, yeah, I definitely just really encouraged by, the work you're doing. Keep it up. Like you are an engineering associate. What does that mean? Like what is a day to
Yes.
day, for those of us who may not know or understand, the work that you're doing at the LA County Sanitation Districts.
Yeah, for sure. So I did want to start by saying that the reason why we've been emphasizing engineering associate instead of engineer is because I'm still in the process of applying for my professional license. So even after obtaining your degree, I'm still required to take the state specific license exam to become a civil engineer, which in my case would be California. So I do have to say engineering associate, but
And,
um, specifically, I am in the wastewater management department in the water reclamation plant section. So that's kind of just like a fancy way of saying people who kind of help treat the water that we
mm,
flush and converting that resource into something reusable. Um, which is really awesome,
totally.
right? Because I know a big reason why I decided to join civil engineering, specifically in the environmental aspect, is because I think that um, uh, our environment in general needs a helping hand itself.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so being able to apply something that I really like to do into something that'll not only give me opportunities to give back to my community, but also my community's public
Mm,
health and the environment's public health was something awesome and what got me most excited about becoming a civil
hmm,
engineer. But yeah, so formally speaking, my duties consist of planning and conducting civil projects related to the operation and maintenance of that water reclamation plant and its extended process of how it converts that wastewater into clean water or reusable
mm.
water.
That's so awesome. No, thank you for obviously, breaking it down. I know it's very important work, and like you're putting into lay people's terms. And that's again, like we live in such a weird world, right? Like in, first world countries where we don't think, like, obviously our bodies are mostly water. The world is mostly water, and we cannot survive without it. But it just like pops up right in our sink, in our
Yeah,
toilets, and it's like, and especially, like you're saying, waste, when you flush the toilet, we don't often think about where that goes. And how do we have running water coming out of our showers, or in our water bottles here, right? Like,
right.
so it's such important work that you're doing. And it's really awesome to hear. Again, like hearing your story, it makes sense, like that's a career that you would pursue, right? Because obviously it's a very holistic and giving
Right.
back in such important work. And so, I mean, again, just like looking back on your journey so far, and you're still very young, but you've experienced so much. Like, for those who are listening, what message or insight would you share with listeners who are facing challenges in their vocational journeys, right? Like we all go through our different journeys and we all have our different challenges, but any words of wisdom that you would share?
Yeah, so this kind of ties back to the biggest thing I got to learn during my undergrad when I was overcoming the imposter syndrome. No one has the power to shatter your dreams unless you
Mm,
allow them to. So definitely don't let other people's limit what you can achieve. Um, most of the important things in the world have been accomplished by people who were trying to figure something out when there was no
mm,
hope at all. And more specifically to the first generation college students, and some of your peers are going to be groomed into the same schools that you attend. And you might not have had the same access to opportunities and privileges as they did, but you got yourself there. So never doubt your place at these schools like I did, or your worth at
yes,
these jobs, or in any
yes.
instance. And also never doubt the accomplishments that you achieve and never forget that you made it alone. So definitely pay everything forward and use your newly found privileges, connections, and positions of power
Mm.
to make changes in your local communities.
Wise words, wise words. Thank you for sharing that. And not only like you're living it too. So really, appreciate you sharing those words of wisdom and encouragement. And definitely want to also ask, like, to your point, right? Nobody does anything alone, right? We live in a very, in the Western world, we live like in
Yeah,
this individualistic sense where we like put heroes on platforms, and we have these Nobel Peace Prizes, right, where we like honor individuals, but behind every individual is a community, is a village, is multiple people, right? And so, like, who would you say are your people that encouraged you, your role models, mentors, resource people, right, that helped you along your vocational journey?
right. Yeah, for sure. So specifically during my professional development aspect, it was definitely the head of the diversity program that I was placed into at UCLA. Her nickname was Sherry. She has a really long first name, but her nickname is Sherry. And she was definitely someone that um, always gave a helping hand when it came out to like what classes I should enroll to, what to expect, um, giving advice of like what to avoid, what to do, how to study, etc. So little things that, may seem a little niche, but things that essentially were really essential to how I would later on perform at school or how I approach things. And so she's definitely someone that I'm really thankful for when it comes specifically to my journey at UCLA and figuring out how um, higher
Mm,
education works. And then in terms of like um, the next step of leaving school and pursuing a job in my field, I was really thankful to my supervisor, who technically wasn't my supervisor because I had gotten an internship during the pandemic, but it got canceled. But I was already assigned to a supervisor, so even though I never really got to work with him, he had my contact, and um, he was a supervisor at LADWP, still is, and he would always make the time and
mm,
effort to ever so often ask how I was doing, which, is a really important question to get. Not everyone is going to ask how you're doing, and it's really nice to get
totally.
that asked. But would also help me and encourage me to apply to certain programs or do certain things so that I can successfully transfer from my degree to a full-time job.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
No, thank you for mentioning both of those, mentors and role models. Thank you for sharing your story and for also doing that, right? Giving back to your community. And a final question here that we're going to ask all the people, all the guests on this podcast, but uh, it's about success. How
right.
do you find success, and how has your perception of success evolved throughout your vocational journey?
So success is definitely going to be subjective and personal to everyone, but I know that a lot of times we hear the word success and we commonly associate it with monetary value, like how well you're doing in terms of finances is what society deems as like whether or not you're successful. But I think success to me is
Mm,
freedom. So being able to feel the difference between just
mm,
living and existing, and having that control and autonomy on being able to define what matters to you and what makes you happy. And it's not a simple answer, and it's definitely changes as you go. So I know that my definition of success may be different in a couple years, but at least where I am now, I know that it's putting more time and effort into my own health and well-being and being able to
yes.
give back, and being comfortable in our
Mm,
own skin. That's definitely what success
yeah,
means
it's
to me.
beautiful. Thank you for sharing those words. And you know, um, I think to your point, I think that's a huge part too about like in a few years, might not mean the same, and I think that's huge too, right? Like hopefully it doesn't, because that means we're continuing to grow and to learn. And so, thank you for sharing,
Right.
just your story today, and for the ways in which you're inspiring, a lot of people, like I mentioned, even like I can see your siblings are, I know you don't have any siblings, biologically, but like your cousins and your other family members, right, who are now like following in your footsteps too,
Yes.
going to UCLA, and like it's just cool to see how even just in your
Yes.
family, you're inspiring people, and I know you're inspiring many others, including those who got to listen today. So thank you for the time. And just as we close, any final words that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so definitely. I know it's a common thing that's always said, but you miss every shot you don't
Yes.
take. The same way that I
Did you
was,
just quote
yeah, the same
Kobe?
way that I felt discouraged and I
Love
guess
it.
I did.
Love it.
Uh, but yeah, the same way that I didn't think that I would be able to go to college, um, but still applying anyways, I wouldn't be able to
Mm.
go had I not applied. So
Yes,
yeah.
those are wise words. Wise words by a wise person, and thank you for embodying them too. Again, just such a great treat to get to listen to your story. Thank you for sharing today, Eric, and can't wait to circle back again and see where you are in a few years, and have you again as a guest on the podcast. So thanks for sharing today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and likewise, I can't wait to see how you're doing in a couple years too, and can't wait to see what everyone else who's listening is at their journey in a couple years. So